Hello. The focus of this video is American federalism. Federalism is a form of government where two levels have the authority to pass laws. In the course of history, there have developed kind of three models of government in terms of where power is distributed. So you have the most common kind is a unitary system where almost all of the authority of government rests with the central government. And then local or sub-governments are given authority by that central government. Then you have the Confederate form of government, which is what the United States had under the Articles of Confederation, which was our first Constitution. And under that arrangement, the power really rests mainly with the states or the sub-governments, and the central government is relatively weak. And that was a problem for the United States under the Articles of Confederation because the U.S. Congress really had no authority to do very much. So what we have developed in our system, and this is a result of the deliberations at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, is we've developed a system of federalism where it's shared. So it's the idea of you having two levels of government, a central government, or in our case we call it the federal government, and then state governments. Now, the idea of federalism is that you have two levels of government that have sovereignty. So it's not like unitary government where all the sovereignty rests with the central government, or a confederacy where the states have most of the authority. In a federal system, the power is distributed between the two levels. And sovereignty is just the idea that a government has the authority to pass laws. Now, that the power is not necessarily equal in federalism. It's not as if there's half the powers here and half the powers there. But the idea is that they do have shared responsibilities and to some degree, even some overlapping responsibilities, which is discussed in your reading. But the federalism in our Constitution really was a product of compromise because the states already had sovereignty when the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, and they weren't going to give that sovereignty up. But the delegates in Philadelphia also recognized that we needed a stronger national government, so they established by essentially this compromise of a federal form of government. Now, the Constitution is very clear about what the authority of the federal government is, that it regulates commerce among the states, it regulates foreign commerce, it establishes the post office, it declares war, it defends the nation, it establishes a currency for the country, money that is. So those are very clearly the responsibilities of the national government. They come through legislation passed by Congress, and then it's implemented by the government. But the Constitution also says that there are certain powers that the Congress is not allowed to carry out, denials of power. Most of those relate to kind of specific things that the framers wanted to make sure that the federal government would recognize certain limits. And then you also have a section of the Constitution that limits what the states can do, denials of power to the states. And some of those denials of power to the states are meant to tell the states, essentially, if we're telling you can't do this, but only the federal government can. And so the idea is that the framers recognized that it was not good if states were, for example, trying to enter into treaties with other countries, which is something that states were kind of trying to do under the Articles of Confederation. So under our Constitution, only the national government can establish treaties or legal agreements between the United States and another country. States can't just enter into a treaty with another country. So that's where the federal authority comes from. The question that a lot of people ask is, well, what about the states? Well, the U.S. Constitution doesn't detail what the states can do, or it does detail a few things they can't do, but it doesn't tell them what they can do. The understanding that the framers had was that whatever was left over would be left to the states. But some of the people who opposed the Constitution said that that's not enough. So after the Constitution was ratified, the Bill of Rights were adopted, and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is what's known as the Reserve Powers Clause, which says whichever powers are not granted to the national government or denied to the states are reserved to the states. And essentially that's what sometimes we call the police powers, because they deal with safety and kind of the basic regulation of society. And really and truly, most of the laws that we have to follow on a regular basis are passed not at the federal level, but at the state level. Now, that doesn't mean the states are more important than the federal government. It doesn't mean that the federal government's more important than the states. It just means that most of the laws that exist that deal with public safety are passed under state authority. Speed limits are an example, or compulsory attendance laws for schools, or when the school year starts, or even serious crimes like murder are handled at the state level usually. Now, there are some crimes that fall under federal jurisdiction, but most fall under state. But the federal government's important because under our Constitution, there is a supremacy clause which says whatever is in the Constitution is the supreme law of our land, and states can't go against that when they pass laws. Another thing about supremacy is that if Congress passes a law based on its authority in the Constitution, states are obligated to follow that law. So, for example, a number of years ago, Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, which is also known as Obamacare. And a number of states at the time, led by Republicans, didn't want to follow that law, but they knew they couldn't just opt out of it, so they went to court to challenge it. And ultimately, the Supreme Court was basically upholding the law as being constitutional. But the idea is that if states don't like a law that Congress has passed, they can go to court, but they can't just say we're not going to follow it. Now, of course, there have been times in our history where states have tried to opt out of the laws of the nation or the Constitution, and they've always been pushed back on that. The most extreme example of that was the Civil War in the mid-19th century, when southern states seceded from the Union over the issue of slavery. They wanted to maintain slavery, and so they fought a bloody civil war to maintain that system of slavery, but ultimately the North did win that war, and it established that states cannot just simply opt out of the Constitution. Once you're part of the U.S. government, once you're a state admitted into the Union, you're always a state in the Union. You can't separate from that, because that would be a violation of the rights of the people, ultimately. In terms of federalism, people sometimes say, well, I mean, how do we know what Congress can do or what the states can do? And of course, we know what Congress can do because it's listed in the Constitution. Now, Congress also has implied powers. It can do things that are necessary and proper to carry out the enumerated powers, which means that over time, Congress has expanded a lot of its activities. One example is education. Well, education is primarily a state responsibility, but in the last 50 to 60 years, Congress has appropriated a lot of money to the states, or given a lot of money to the states for education to help students who come from low-income backgrounds, or students who are performing poorly. Head Start and school lunch programs and lots of different educational programs that are carried out at the state level are funded partly with federal dollars. And anytime the federal government gives money to the states for something, it expects them to meet certain conditions, and that's discussed in your reading. So if it gives a categorical grant comes with conditions and strings, and states have to abide by those conditions. A block grant allows a little more freedom, but ultimately it really puts the federal government in some degree of having some degree of authority over state action. Now, there are people who criticize that, saying, well, that's going against the Constitution because the Constitution lets the states kind of do what they want. Well, not really. I mean, they still have to abide by the Constitution and the laws of the nation. And federal grants are not... sometimes states will opt out of certain grant programs because they don't like it for whatever reason. They're not legally obligated to abide by a grant if they don't want to take it. But states also see the value in getting those grants because it allows them to do a lot of things they couldn't do without them. And certainly our roads, schools, healthcare, a lot of the programs that we rely on and that we have come to value are funded through federal dollars, but states participate in that by also contributing money. So the system of American federalism looks a lot different today than it did, say, 50, 60, 70, or 100 years ago or more. People would generally say that it's good that the federal government is helping the states with education, roads, healthcare, and other things. But certainly there is an argument that people make that that's given the federal government too much power over the states. But it's just simply the reality, and regardless of which political party happens to be in charge of our government, there's never really a major push to pull back from that. There have been different times where presidents or Congresses have tried to give a little bit more power to the states, but generally the federal government has the upper hand in kind of negotiating with the states on money. And anytime there's an economic recession or the country is going through something very tough, there are always calls for Congress to step in and try to help the states with that issue, whether it's providing stimulus checks to taxpayers or it could be providing money to states to deal with a major catastrophe. Federal government has a lot of money, and the states have the know-how to run things. And so, in American federalism, that's the advantage. States kind of know their citizens better. The federal government has resources, and they can work together through a system of cooperative federalism to really serve the greater public. So federalism has changed a lot. In chapter 3, there's a lot of discussion about some other ideas within American federalism, advantages, disadvantages. But certainly in a country of the size of the United States, 50 states, a number of territories, federalism really is the best kind of system to use, because unitary system would not work in a country as large as the United States, and a confederate form is just giving the states way too much authority. So federalism is really a nice balance. So read the chapter. If you have any questions, let me know, and have a great week.